Grab your favorite beverage and settle in for a wild ride through one of the most bizarre chapters in American history. We're talking about Prohibition, the era when American lawmakers decided we needed to go cold turkey on alcohol. It's the late 1800s and America is swimming in booze. The average American is drinking about 3 times as much as we do today. Not to hurt your ego, but your great-great-grandfather could drink you under the table. And that's a fact. Saloons are on every corner, and they're not just serving drinks. They're hotbeds of gambling, prostitution, and political corruption. This illicit activity leads many to blame alcohol for the demoralization of America, and this gives rise to the temperance movement. Groups like the Anti-Saloon League and the Women's Christian Temperance Union view alcohol as a social evil that needs to be eradicated.
Lined with the boys and bums, spending their money, debauching their characters, rotting their bodies, and jeopardizing their immortal souls.
So they level an all-out attack on the consumption of alcohol. And these party poopers didn't mess around. Wielding axes and smashing up saloons soon became a regular occurrence. Their leader, a woman by the name of Carrie Nation, became so famous for her bar-busting antics that street peddlers started selling souvenir hatchets. Shout out to merchandising. But it's not only the frustrated wives and religious folk who feel this way. Businesses and the industrial sector are suffering as well. Employers are fed up with workers showing up to the assembly line just short of death, or even worse, still embalmed from the night before. And with this mounting pressure to reform, Prohibition becomes the law of the land on January 17th, 1920. But this by no means turned the U.S. into a nation of teetotalers. Telling Americans they can't do something is like waving a red flag in front of a bull. Speakeasies, also known as blind pigs or blind tigers, surfaced overnight, replacing the now bygone saloon. Ranging from high-end nightclubs to dingy basements, Americans soon found recourse in these makeshift watering holes. At the height of the Prohibition, there was an estimated 100,000 of them in New York City alone. Run by crime syndicates, they served unregulated bootleg liquor, very often of questionable contents. Bartenders became mixologists out of necessity, and many of the cocktails that we still drink today emerged from this era. When your base spirit tastes like paint thinner, you gotta get creative. Not only did the speakeasy supply alcohol, but the party as well. They became the social hubs for every tier of society as people of all genders, race, and class frolicked under one roof. The Roaring Twenties had arrived and jazz became all the rage. Flappers, women wearing short skirts and sporting bobbed hair, danced the shimmy and the outlawed Charleston. Mobsters rubbed elbows with politicians and sometimes even the very cops that were supposed to arrest them. In an effort to enforce the ban, the Bureau of Prohibition was created. But being outnumbered and outgunned, these dry agents were virtually ineffective at quelling the onslaught of illegal bootleggers and crime syndicates. And speakeasy owners were clever, disguising their establishments as genuine businesses and storefronts. These establishments relied on secrecy as their main defense against raids from law enforcement, and passwords or coded phrases were required for entry. Prone to being hacked, they often were changed regularly, made known solely by word of mouth, the social media of the day. But raids by the coppers were inevitable, and speakeasy owners had contingency plans for this as well. Trap doors allowed patrons to seemingly disappear, and some bars were rigged to slide readily into the back wall. One proprietor even had a chute that dumped patrons into a nearby river. What became of them from there? Your guess is as good as mine. But if your local speakeasy did get busted, you could always make a call on your doctor to cure your withdrawal symptoms. They could prescribe medicinal whiskey for everything from toothaches to the common cold. Or you could buy a grape brick, a solid chunk of dehydrated grape juice, which came with a stern warning against mixing it with water and leaving it in a dark cupboard for 21 days. Else it might ferment and turn into wine. Failing these, distillation equipment was still available at your local hardware store. But you didn't hear that from me. Illegal liquor on the black market became a huge business for gangsters like Al Capone and Lucky Luciano, who made millions from both the transportation and production of illegal booze. Capone's empire in Chicago alone raked in over $100 million a year. That's $1.4 billion by today's standards. Their turf battles turned major cities into war zones, and bootlegging, the production and selling of illegal booze, arising from the practice of concealing flasks of liquor in one's boot top, became a thriving network as the demand for alcohol in no way diminished. Makeshift stills produced homemade moonshine, and bathtub gin made in actual bathtubs was considered a good batch if it didn't blind you. Shipments and booze runs were coordinated through coded messages during regular show broadcasts on the radio, and booze smugglers modified their cars to outrun authorities while transporting their hooch. Many of these rot-gut runners used their fine-tuned driving skills to race one another in public exhibitions, and these customized cars would later spawn stock car racing and eventually the NASCAR that we know today. But drinking unregulated booze doesn't come highly recommended. This isn't medical advice, it's just common sense. Unscrupulous hoochmakers sometimes used questionable substitutes in their products, such as industrial alcohol and methanol, potentially resulting in blindness or even death for anyone unlucky or desperate enough to imbibe these toxic cocktails. Not only that, the feds would actually poison these forms of alcohol in order to discourage consumption of it. Talk about a killer hangover. But not all of the liquor was a health hazard. The infamous rum runner, Captain Bill McCoy, ensured his product was on the level and kept it real. Hence the phrase, the real McCoy. By the early 1930s, it became clear to even the staunchest Prohibition supporters that outlawing booze was ill-fated. Turns out the ban on alcohol fostered an environment that gave rise to even more crime and corruption. Go figure. By the onset of the Great Depression, everyone is fed up by the liquor ban. Plus, the government is missing out on all that sweet, sweet alcohol tax revenue. Franklin Delano Roosevelt promised he would put an end to Prohibition if elected president, and turns out he read the room perfectly. In 1933, Roosevelt won the election, and after 13 years, Prohibition was finally repealed at the federal level. But in all actuality, it only unburdened the government of all culpability, handing the final decision over to the state level, and the states were left holding the bag. Some Americans still got the short end of the stick, as many states still lean towards temperance. Mississippi didn't ditch their restrictions until 1966, over 30 years later. But for the most part, it was met with widespread celebration across the country, ushering in a new era of decadence. And soon after, a truck full of beer was delivered to the Capitol steps. If anything, Prohibition was a cautionary tale. America learned that somewhere between regulation and freedom lied the solution to its problems with alcohol. Moderation over abstinence was best. As for what the government learned, well, probably nothing.